Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I declare open the first meeting of states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. The meeting will now consider sub-item A, entitled Election of the President, of item 2 of the provisional agenda entitled Election of Officers. On 9th of February 2021, the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs circulated a non-verbal to states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, inviting them to communicate to the Secretariat the names of their candidates for the position of President of the first meeting of states parties by 16th of February 2021. The only nomination received was Austria's nomination of Ambassador Alexander Kmentt. Consequently, on 17th of February 2021, I informed states parties of my intention to propose Ambassador Kmentt for election as President at the opening of the first meeting of states parties. I note that in the intervening months, Ambassador Kmentt has led the preparations of this meeting with the full support of states parties. I also take this opportunity to thank him for the excellent cooperation with the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs. Thank you. As there is only a single candidate for the position of President of this meeting, may I take it that the meeting decides to dispense with the secret ballot for this election? I see no objection. It is so decided. We will now proceed with the election. May I take it that it is the wish of the meeting to elect Ambassador Alexander Kmentt of Austria as President of the first meeting of states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons? I see no objection. It is so decided. I congratulate Ambassador Kmentt on his election and assure him of the full support of the Office for Disarmament Affairs in the discharge of his duties. Your Excellency, please take your position.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, dear colleagues from civil society, academia, and especially dear hibakusha and victims of nuclear weapons testing. It's a great honor for my country, for me personally, and for the whole Austrian team to preside over this historic conference. I take up this responsibility with great respect and humility because I'm aware of the importance of this conference. We are at a threshold moment in the debate about nuclear weapons. Nuclear risks are higher today than probably ever. Nuclear threats are being made, and we are witness to disconcerting rhetoric about the use of nuclear weapons. We are on the cusp of a nuclear arms race, of a new nuclear arms race, with a re-emphasis on the dangerous narrative about the utility of nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence. Virtually all indicators for nuclear weapons are pointing in the wrong direction, except our treaty. It is a ray of hope for the international community against an otherwise very dire and dangerous backdrop. This is what makes the TPNW so important, and this is what makes the TPNW so precious, especially right now. We have to seize the opportunity of this first meeting of states parties to strengthen our young treaty and to establish its implementation in the best and strongest way possible. This treaty is needed now more than ever, and this is the responsibility that we have in the next 3 days. I have had the honor of facilitating the preparations for the meeting for over a year now, due to the delays caused by the COVID pandemic. And these preparations have taken place in an exemplary, cooperative and constructive spirit. The sense of responsibility that I mentioned before was tangible throughout. All of us, states parties, signatories, observer representatives of international organizations such as the United Nations and the ICRC, our friends from civil society and from academia, all of us understand that we need to get this meeting right. We need to send a strong message about the seriousness with which we are approaching this treaty, with which we are going to work to strengthen and implement it, and of our commitment to achieving a world without nuclear weapons. Because this is the best we can do to counter the negative nuclear trends, to keep the focus on the urgency of progress in nuclear disarmament, and to counter some of the negative attitudes against the TPNW. Let me acknowledge also at this moment the presence of several observers from nuclear umbrella states. We appreciate you being here. We see this as a recognition of the importance of the treaty and as your readiness to engage constructively in the discussion on the profound arguments about the humanitarian consequences and risks of nuclear weapons on which the TPNW is based. And this discussion is urgently needed. Dear colleagues, my team and I have appreciated the constructive culture of work in the TPNW over the past months. It's quite a contrast to what we see elsewhere in the nuclear disarmament field. Together we have prepared this conference well and with a strong focus on substance and on openness. I would like to thank those states that have taken up the role as facilitators and have prepared our substantive decisions well, and we have many important decisions to take. I'm convinced that this constructive attitude will be on display also in the next 3 days, and that we will achieve the strong outcome that we have set out to accomplish. I'm also convinced that we will send a strong message for both this treaty and for a world without nuclear weapons. That is the aspiration of all humanity and that we need to pursue with urgency. Let's get to work. Thank you. Before we start with a high-level opening session, we have something to celebrate. Let us congratulate Cabo Verde, Grenada, and Timor-Leste that have deposited their instruments of ratification in New York yesterday. This is wonderful news for all of us. This is wonderful news for all of us, especially at the beginning of the meeting of states parties, which brings the number of ratifying states to 65. The meeting will now consider item 4 of the provisional agenda entitled High-Level Opening Session, address by the Secretary General of the United Nations and addresses by high-level officials. We will now hear a pre-recorded message, video message, from His Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations.
Nuclear weapons are a global scourge, a deadly reminder of countries' inability to solve problems through dialogue and collaboration. These weapons offer false promises of security and deterrence, while guaranteeing only destruction, death, and endless brinksmanship. Today, the terrifying lessons of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are fading from memory. The once unthinkable prospect of nuclear conflict is now back within the realm of possibility. More than 13,000 nuclear weapons are being held in arsenals across the globe. In a world rife with geopolitical tensions and mistrust, this is a recipe for annihilation. We cannot allow the nuclear weapons wielded by a handful of states to jeopardize all life on our planet. We must stop knocking at doomsday's door. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is an important step towards the common aspiration of a world without nuclear weapons. Your gathering this week brings together governments, but also civil society groups and other observers. This wide participation reflects a central truth. Disarmament is everybody's business, because life itself is everybody's business. The decisions you make at this meeting will help cement the treaty's position as an essential element of the global disarmament and non-proliferation architecture. And it will hopefully convince more countries to get on board. It is only by joining in solidarity that we can eliminate this scourge and get back to the business of building a better, more peaceful and trusting world for all. Let's eliminate these weapons before they eliminate us. Thank you.
I would like to ask the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs to convey to the Secretary General the gratitude of states parties for his message and for his support for the treaty, and especially for his encouragement to all states to consider joining the treaty. Further to my correspondence with states parties on 16th June, and in recognition of their outstanding contribution to achieving the TPNW, I would now like to give the floor to the President of the International Committee of the Red Cross, to be followed by the Executive Director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, and then to Mr. Kuyukov-Karipek to speak on behalf of survivors. I would now like to invite Peter Maurer to take the floor. Please, sir.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, today is a historic moment, and I'm deeply honored and humbled to address you. We have gathered here to put into effect the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and to shape the future of nuclear disarmament. A decade ago, this may have seemed illusory. Today, a global, unequivocal, comprehensive prohibition of nuclear weapons, the most catastrophic weapons ever created, is a reality. We owe this reality to the tireless efforts of many states who, with conviction and determination, took initiatives to bring forward meaningful multilateral negotiations, knowing that because of the sheer scale of nuclear weapons' catastrophic impact, humanitarian concerns had to come first. National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, who along with the ICRC did not cease to call for the abolition of nuclear weapons since the first atomic bombs were detonated in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Bold, ambitious civil society organizations who over the years helped build the impetus and momentum that led us to the adoption of the TPNW. And the unwavering courage and hope of survivors of nuclear weapons use and testing, who drove our efforts since the beginning and who never ceased to inspire us, we owe this treaty to them. The continued existence of nuclear weapons is one of the biggest threats for humanity. Their use would have catastrophic humanitarian consequences capable of endangering the very survival of the planet. The risk of such use are growing in terms of both probability and magnitude of effect. At a time when, against the backdrop of the conflict in Ukraine, nuclear deterrence theories seem to be regaining vigor and apparent legitimacy, it is critical to refocus the debate on what nuclear weapon use, even so-called low-yield tactical nuclear weapon, would mean for civilians and combatants and for the natural environment on which we all depend. If a nuclear weapon were to detonate in or near a populated area, no state or international body could adequately address the immediate humanitarian emergency, nor the long-term consequences, nor provide sufficient assistance to victims. Why is it so important to focus on the consequences of nuclear weapons? Because they are the benchmark against which the moral, ethical and legal acceptability of a weapon is to be judged, and deterrence theories are to be evaluated. Indeed, while the professed purpose of nuclear deterrence is to maintain national and regional security, the existence of nuclear weapons poses major risks to human security, including individual and collective health, well-being, environmental and food security, as well as our natural environment. It is the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons on human health, on the environment, on future generations that make these weapons inhumane, immoral, and since the entry into force of the TPNW, also illegal under conventional international law. In light of these consequences, in the ICRC's view, it is extremely doubtful that nuclear weapons could ever be used in accordance with the rules and principles of international humanitarian law. Moreover, any use of nuclear weapons would be abhorrent to the principles of humanity and dictates of public conscience. And threat to use nuclear weapons is, in the ICRC's view, equally abhorrent because it implies the possibility of actually using them. Nuclear disarmament is an urgent humanitarian and legal imperative. The comprehensive prohibition of nuclear weapons by means of the TPNW is a crucial step towards their elimination, which is a vital responsibility of the international community as a whole. Pending this, effective risk reduction measures need to be taken urgently. This is first and foremost the responsibility of nuclear-armed states and their allies. Dear colleagues, the first meeting of states parties is an important milestone for the success of the treaty. It will establish a framework for the effective implementation and progressive universalization of the TPNW and underscore the treaty's significant added value within the broader nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation architecture. It will send a clear signal that the treaty is a credible instrument capable of having a real impact. For this purpose, it is important to strike a balance between ambition and realism. The ICRC has submitted a working paper with concrete recommendations to state parties on the implementation of the treaty and on the outcome of the meeting, which I strongly encourage you to consider. Cooperation and assistance with states outside the TPNW can also contribute significantly to the effective implementation of the treaty. It is therefore important to develop synergies, including in the context of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and to explore the complementarity of the two instruments, in particular on the provision of assistance to victims and the remediation of the natural environmental impact by the use of testing and nuclear weapons. The ICRC and the broader Red Cross and Red Crescent movement will continue to work tirelessly to strengthen the membership of the TPNW and its implementation and to promote nuclear disarmament until the goal of a world free from nuclear weapons becomes a reality. I wish you a successful conference, and I thank you for the opportunity to address you.
I would like to thank the President of the International Committee of the Red Cross for his statement, and I now give the floor to Ms. Beatrice Finn, Executive Director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons.
Mr. President, High Representative, distinguished delegates, colleagues, and friends. 7.5 years ago, governments and civil society gathered here in Vienna for the 2014 conference on the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons. And at the conclusion of that conference, the government of Austria launched what would become the humanitarian pledge. And governments endorsing this pledge called on states to identify and pursue effective measures to fill the legal gap for the prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons. And they pledged to cooperate with all relevant stakeholders, states, international organizations, the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Movement, parliamentarians, and civil society in efforts to stigmatize, prohibit, eliminate nuclear weapons in light of their unacceptable humanitarian consequences and associated risks. And this is exactly what you did. Exactly what you, the states, parties, and signatories to this treaty did. In the face of skepticism and doubts, in the face of decades of inertia and paralysis in multilateral disarmament, in the face of some bitter and sometimes underhanded opposition from some of the world's most powerful countries, cooperating with survivors, impacted communities, civil society, and other relevant stakeholders. As you had pledged, you negotiated and adopted and brought into force a treaty banning nuclear weapons. With the entry into force of this treaty in January 2021, the legal gap was filled. Nuclear weapons are now comprehensively prohibited under international law, as other weapons of mass destruction have been for decades. This is an extraordinary and transformative achievement. On behalf of ICANN and our 635 partner organizations, I would like to express our profound gratitude to all the states parties, the signatures, and all the other governments that worked with such determination to bring this treaty into being. And the need for the treaty is clearer and more urgent than ever. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its threats to use nuclear weapons have increased the already unacceptable risks of use and brought the terrible prospects of nuclear war and the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons to the forefront of public consciousness. And the TPNW community must act decisively against such threats and do everything possible to prevent the use of nuclear weapons. So while we join you in celebrating this moment, there is no time to be lost. What we have prohibited, we must now work to eliminate. And as we cooperated to make the treaty, we must now work together to implement it. With determination and energy, during this meeting, in the months and the years ahead, we in civil society will work with you to implement your national obligations and to develop the mechanisms for assisting survivors of the use or testing of nuclear weapons and for remediating environmental contamination. We will work with you to persuade all states to join the treaty. And we will work with you to raise awareness and broaden the understanding of the true consequences of any use of nuclear weapons. And we will work with you in every setting, in every channel, to stigmatize and delegitimize nuclear weapons and to strengthen the norm embodied in this treaty. There is a really long road ahead of us, but we are ready and we look forward to working with you on this. Thank you.
I would like to thank the Executive Director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons for her statement. I now give the floor to Mr. Karipek Kokuyov of Kazakhstan, who will make a statement on behalf of survivors of the use and testing of nuclear weapons. You have the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, здравствуйте, уважаемые.
Dear participants of this meeting, good morning. I'm very pleased to be taking the floor before you. I'd like to thank the organizers of our meeting for that. My life is an illustration of the horrors of nuclear testing. I was born without arms in a small village called Yigidinbak. It is 100 kilometers from the former Semipalatinsk testing site. At this site, the Soviet Union tested 456 nuclear devices between 1949 and 1991. I saw much suffering in my village. Very often we woke up in the morning when our house would be shaking from explosion waves, which traveled 100 kilometers from the epicenter of the explosion. Dishes would be shaking on the shelves, chandeliers in the ceiling. We would run out to the street as we were afraid of staying in the house because the houses were small, old. The shepherds of the village would then brag that they had seen a bright explosion, that the nuclear mushroom. Later, they would taste iron in their mouths. Their heads would ache. Their teeth would fall as well as their hair. They would lose their sight. I remember one time that my dad took me on a work trip. He was a driver. Very often, we went through the Polygon or Palatinsk testing site territory as a shortcut. I'll never forget when I saw young soldiers who were serving in the Polygon in hot summer days who would swim in the nuclear lake. This lake had formed at the very epicenter of the explosion. Many of them didn't survive. After each test, people would be left with a horrifying picture. There would be dead birds in the streets, half-dead dogs who had lost all of their fur, lambs born with 2 heads. When children would be born deformed, the midwives would faint from seeing them. There were several tragedies in my family. Children were born who didn't even live to be a year old. There was a baby boy who lived for 6 months, then a baby girl only 8. After these 2 deaths, I was born with no arms. This was a shock for my mother. She actually didn't want to see me. At that time, the doctors proposed to my father that they might give me a shot to put me out of my suffering and to relieve my mother. The decision that my father took was for us a test for the rest of our lives, but I thank him for it. Radiation distinguishes not hair color, nor eye color, nor skin color. You don't see radiation, you can't seize it with your hands, but it quickly invades the human body and destroys it slowly. Those who are lucky enough to live hand these things down genetically, from generation to generation in newborn babies. In Semipalatinsk, there is still an orphanage where abandoned children live. It is always full. What this means is that we are still seeing mutations appearing in children. due to the testing. I remember when the military forces left the polygon and left a huge landfill filled with tanks, airplanes, all contaminated, nothing sectioned off with caution tape, all of it in the open air. We actually used to pick through the landfill to see if there was anything that we might use spare parts. This was the 90s. It was when the Soviet Union had fallen, and Kazakhstan had just started taking first steps towards its independence. I remember how people at that time, and I mean those living in the polygon, would simply dig through this landfill, hoping to find some kind of parts or metal that they could sell to China. I remember when they would even get into the underground bunkers. As you can imagine, the radiation levels there were through the roof. Nobody wanted to buy that metal in China because it was contaminated. And these people died for nothing. I remember when they died. In light of the above, I decided to dedicate my life to combating nuclear weapons. I have expressed my pain through creativity by painting the full picture of the tragedy of the consequences of nuclear testing. I call upon the international community to think about that which is most important, a safe future for future generations. I'm very happy to see my friends who continue this combat and drive, which of course, the end goal is a full elimination of nuclear weapons. Thank you.
I would like to thank Mr. Karipek for his statement. Your important testimony, which you shared with us on behalf of all survivors of nuclear weapons, underscores why we need to redouble our efforts. Without the voices of survivors, we would not be here, and we would not have a TPNW. We will now proceed to hear addresses of high-level officials. The meeting will now hear an address by His Excellency Josiah Voreke Bainimarama, Prime Minister and Minister for Itaukai Affairs, Sugar Industry, Foreign Affairs and Forestry of the Republic of Fiji.
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, Bulavinaka. Excellencies, in 1957, a contingent of Fijian soldiers and sailors set course for Christmas Island. That day's commanding officer could see his men's fear upon learning their mission was a hydrogen bomb test. He never forgot it, nor would he ever forget the 800-kiloton blast they were made to witness from the boat deck. That officer, ladies and gentlemen, was Ratunoke Bainimarama, my late father. He was not tested for radiation, nor were the men under his command. And while many succumbed to early deaths, their suffering was silenced by history. I am not here for my father's sake. I'm here for the countless stories like his own across the world. The Pacific alone endured more than 300 nuclear tests on land, air, sea, and below the seabed that unleashed the equivalent of more than 14,000 of the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima. The people of French Polynesia and the Marshall Islands still suffer birth defects, cancers, and other deadly generational consequences of the devastation. The terrible legacy of those tests were the only waste that was created. It was the weapons that were perfected. Thousands of missiles and trillions of dollars later, every person on earth is hostage to arsenals that threaten our existence. Today, Fiji is proud to join over 86 states to adopt a treaty on prohibition of nuclear weapons and take this first step back from the knife edge of Armageddon. I congratulate you, Mr. President, on this first meeting. It is not idealism that convinces us. It is level-headed common sense that calls on us to do away with this means of species extinction. Neither are we the fringe of the debate. We are a coalition, united by a shared value for human life. I welcome the NATO members who have joined us. This solution depends on your influence and action. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, per capita, Fijians contribute more of our sons and daughters to UN peacekeeping than any country. We have fought for peace. Our people have died for it. And I can tell you we can never know genuine peace if nations use the apocalypse as a bargaining chip. True peace is built by people with people, not behind desks with our fingers hovering over buttons. Mutually assured destruction isn't a strategy. It is a sham that merely shifts the cost of war. We've seen that price paid in Syria, in Afghanistan, and yet again on our collective watch in Ukraine, a conflict where nuclear facilities were weaponized and nuclear warfare was shamefully threatened. These weapons are the causes of opportunity. This first meeting is held as the COVID-19 pandemic still ravages many parts of the world. A global food crisis rages on a scale not seen in our lifetimes, and a runaway climate crisis threatens lives, livelihoods, and the very future of our civilization. Nuclear weapons will never defeat these enemies. They do not feed us, they do not clothe us, or keep out the rising seas. They are relics, multi-trillion-dollar monuments to the worst horror that war can create. They epitomize the same short-sightedness that created the climate crisis, worsened the pandemic, and continues to keep food from the hungry. Worse, their staggering expense cripples our response to these challenges. The 9 nuclear nations are projected to spend more than $100 billion every year to maintain their nuclear arsenals. Need I remind anyone, ladies and gentlemen, that is the sum of finance developed nations pledge and then fail to deliver to climate vulnerable nations by 2020. Every dollar we spend on these missiles instead of seawalls, resilient crops, relocations, and renewables is a moral aberration, a failure of the most basic choice between life or death. Fiji has signed and ratified the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and we endorse its full scope and ambition. Our message to all nations is that when they come to our region, they leave their nuclear weapons behind. This treaty follows years of advocacy and policies that are vital to our global effort for peace, including through non-proliferation treaties. We welcome this treaty's consideration of the plight of those affected by the use and testing of nuclear weapons who have been silenced and denied the care and support they needed. I urge us to go further for these survivors by creating a policy framework that considers the existential impact on the nuclear testing of our oceans and environment exacerbated by the climate crisis and its long-term consequences of the displacement of communities from their traditional lands due to ever-encroaching nuclear waste. To my fellow Fijians watching from home, as your leader, I reassure you that we will work closely with all states, large and small, through this conference and through every bilateral engagement to secure a nuclear weapons-free world and to heal the wounds of a dark nuclear legacy that continues to harm lives and communities across the region. That is both my solemn duty and my firmest commitment. Your Excellencies, my fellow leaders, we have a moment before us that can free the minds, the resources and technologies that are captive to this insane industry. We can finally set our priorities straight and walk a path that preserves life instead of threatens it. Mr. President, it would be remiss of me not to thank the many leaders from across the Blue Pacific before me and thousands of faith-based and civil society leaders and members who have campaigned relentlessly for decades. Today, we do more than hear them, and those who have suffered from these weapons. We take a step towards the justice and genuine peace that they deserve. Thank you.
On behalf of the meeting, I would like to thank His Excellency, the Prime Minister of the Republic of Fiji, for the statement just made and ask protocol to escort. And I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Mukhtar Teloy Berdi, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs of Kazakhstan. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, at the outset, I would like to congratulate His Excellency Alexander Kmentt, Ambassador of Austria, for assuming the presidency of the first meeting of state parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, as well as for his tremendous effort to organize this meeting, and I wish him every success in his work ahead. I also extend my appreciation to the Bureau members and to the facilitators for preparing the substantive documents and for their willingness to shoulder this immense responsibility on our behalf. I take this opportunity to thank Madam Izumi Nakamitsu, High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, and her team for supporting the state parties, including Kazakhstan, in all their initiatives. Dear ladies and gentlemen, the first meeting of state parties to the TPNW is a remarkable historic achievement following a nearly decade-long collective effort to advance the universal objective of complete nuclear disarmament. We believe that this meeting will result in successful outcomes motivated by our deep commitment and political will to find common ground on the issue of general and complete nuclear disarmament. Kazakhstan has been actively involved in all stages of the TPNW drafting and adoption process and was one of the first states to sign and ratify the treaty. The TPNW is a testament for the ever-increasing demand for more concrete action towards a world free of nuclear weapons. This aspiration takes on particular importance amidst current alarming circumstances when the risk of nuclear confrontation have reached their highest level since the darkest days of the Cold War. Therefore, the TPNW must become an instrumental platform to voice these concerns and find solutions. Kazakhstan's decision to join the treaty was not only politically driven, but also guided by our long-standing commitment to nuclear disarmament. According to the President of Kazakhstan, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, achieving of the nuclear weapon-free world has become an essential part of the nationwide identity of Kazakh people, giving us the moral right to be at the forefront of global movement to eliminate nuclear weapons. We draw strength from the humanitarian obligation which we owe the past generations who suffered from the destructive legacy of the Soviet nuclear weapons program. In this context, I sincerely welcome the representative of impacted communities from around the world attending sideline events of the meeting, including my home country, as witnesses of the nuclear nightmare that we must avoid at all costs. We strongly agree that focusing on implementing the treaty's positive obligations regarding victim assistance and environmental remediation would offer a promising route for advancing the TPNW agenda at the time of strong political impediments for nuclear disarmament. To promote the moral imperative for victim assistance and environmental remediation and ensure broader discussion of this topic, we are hosting a side event on the margin of this conference, along with Kiribati and NGOs, with participation of second and third generation victims of nuclear tests. We also welcome all the participants at the exhibition on our country's nuclear legacy. Excellencies, Kazakhstan is co-founder of the Semipalatinsk Treaty, which established the Central Asian nuclear weapon-free zone in the Northern Hemisphere, flanked by 2 nuclear weapon states. To broadly expand the areas free from nuclear weapons on our planet, we attach particular importance to enhancing cooperation among the existing zones, as reflected in Action 5 of the Secretary General's Agenda for Disarmament. Kazakhstan will do its utmost in its capacity as the chair of the first committee of the forthcoming 77th session of the UN General Assembly. We will endeavor to facilitate important discussions on the issues of disarmament, as well as global challenges and threats to peace that are impacting global growth and development. Ladies and gentlemen, the state parties and signatories to the TPNW have always demonstrated outstanding level of convergence and solidarity in their discussions within the preparatory process. I am confident that this spirit of collaboration will be strengthened as the treaty's membership widens in the coming years. This will pave the way for fair, inclusive, and transparent process for everyone. In this regard, I fully welcome the presence of observer states at today's meeting, and I strongly believe that more will join us in the near future. We have to work jointly towards universalization of the TPNW based on the experience of other disarmament treaties. In this process, we can seek the determined support from civil society, academia, and youth with their proactive role and ideas. This is particularly relevant in the lead-up to the 10th NPT Review Conference in August this year and beyond. We also welcome a decision of this meeting to implement provisions of the TPNW in determining deadline for eliminating the nuclear weapons program. To this end, we need to establish an adequate international institutional framework mandated to verify that all nuclear weapon programs are eliminated for good and irreversible. Mr. President, allow me once again to reiterate my delegation's full support for your endeavor to successfully accomplish this meeting's agenda. Let me also congratulate our distinguished colleagues from Mexico for their nomination to the presidency of the second meeting of state parties. And I assure them of our all-hearted support as they navigate the next steps, of our full readiness to assume the presidency of the third meetings of state parties, and pledge to do our best to fulfill all our obligations. Kazakhstan is committed to contributing to this forum and achieving our long-cherished aspirations towards a world free from nuclear weapons. Thank you.
would like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Kazakhstan for his statement. And I now give the floor to His Excellency Alexander Schallenberg, Federal Minister for European and International Affairs of Austria.
Mr. President, Excellencies, dear colleagues, and I might say, dear friends, it's really great to see all of you here, to feel this positive energy. It's truly inspiring, and I'm confident that this positive energy, this inspiration will carry you through the coming days. 8 years ago, in 2014, at the Vienna Conference on the Humanitarian Impact of Nuclear Weapons, we together issued the Austrian Pledge, later known as the Humanitarian Pledge. In this pledge, we collectively committed to, and I quote, fill the legal gap and prohibit nuclear weapons due to the unacceptable humanitarian consequences and risks. Today, 8 years later, I have the immense pleasure to welcome you back in Vienna for the first meeting of the state parties of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Dear friends, we have really gone a long way, and we can be proud of what we have achieved. This is an historic treaty, and we have fulfilled our pledge. However, this should be a time to celebrate, but actually it's not. War has returned to Europe, and the shockwaves of this war can be felt around the globe. But not only that, Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine has been accompanied by explicit threats of the use of nuclear weapons. This is blatant nuclear blackmail. It's a clear violation of the UN Charter and completely irresponsible and utterly unacceptable. These developments are a severe shock for the entire nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime. What is more, they have put one truth sharply into focus. As long as these horrendous weapons exist, they are a threat to us all. Nuclear risks have not been this high for decades, and it is our responsibility to draw the right lessons. Some see recent developments as a validation of nuclear deterrence. I'm convinced that such a conclusion is not only wrong, but also extremely dangerous, because in its final consequence, it is no less than a call for further proliferation. And the logic that nuclear weapons provide security is a fundamental error, because deterrence requires credibility, meaning the readiness to actually use these weapons. This is nothing less than a massive nuclear sword of Damocles hanging over the head of all of us, of all of humanity. Ladies and gentlemen, we must take, and we have taken, a different path, one not based on the threat of mass destruction and unimaginable human suffering, one that is not a perpetual bet against the common security of us all. For this, we need a paradigm shift in the way the international community looks at nuclear weapons. First, we cannot continue to assume that these weapons will never be used again. Our policies should not be based on wishful thinking. We need a more realistic approach based on evidence, and we have the evidence on our side. Second, we must counter the narrative that any possession of nuclear weapons is legitimate. They are unacceptable because of the humanitarian risks and consequences. As former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan put it once, there are no right hands that can handle the wrong weapons. The TPNW presents exactly this new paradigm. And yet, we all know that we are facing an uphill struggle. But I'm convinced of the treaty's tremendous transformational power. Together, and especially with the help of civil society, and I'm very proud of this very strong partnership we have. This is really a successful PPP, this treaty. Together with the civil society, we were able to make progress. Slowly, yes. Step by step, yes. But persistently. And I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic because we have the evidence on our side and because there's simply no alternative if we want to remove this existential threat for all of us. So let us set the course to implement the milestones of this treaty by adopting the important decisions on the table, some technical and some of immediate humanitarian importance, such as the work on victim assistance and environmental remediation, by convincing others to join and to ratify the TPNW. And let me extend this appeal to all of our partners attending as observers today. We very much welcome your presence, and we hope that you will take the step, sign the treaty, and ratify it for all of us. We are here together today to send a very strong signal that multilateral cooperation is the only way to deal with issues of global concern, and that all states have an equally valid stake when it comes to our common security. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, we are living through crucial times. This is a crucial moment in history, one that requires a great sense of responsibility. And you have all come to Vienna today to heed this call. And I'm convinced that with this common spirit, with this positive energy I feel in this room, our conference will be another milestone on our way towards a world free of nuclear weapons. I wish you all, I wish us all, a successful conference. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank the Federal Minister for European and International Affairs of Austria. And I now give the floor to His Excellency Bruno Eduardo Rodriguez Parilla, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba. Excellency.
Señor Presidente.
Chair, congratulations on your election and congratulations to all other officers elected at this historic first meeting of state parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which entered into force on the 22nd of January 2021 and was a landmark moment. For the first time, we have established a legally binding international instrument stating that nuclear weapons are not only inhumane, immoral, and ethically indefensible, but also illegal. Our meeting today takes place in a complex context in which our nations are facing serious security challenges. We're seeing an increase in unconventional warfare, as well as an increase in modernization of weapons, which are undermining international peace and security with impunity. They weaken multilateralism, and they wear away at the disarmament machinery of the United Nations. We're living in an absurd world where exorbitant resources are squandered on weapons, including nuclear weapons, while at the same time we're not complying with commitments to help with development, disproportionately increasing the polarization of wealth, and in which millions of people continue to be victims of hunger and poverty. Global military spending, which has been growing at a dizzying pace over the past 7 years, has now reached a historic high, for the first time going over the figure of $2 trillion. The United States alone in 2021 spent over $800 billion on the industry of war. Such huge spending on weapons should instead be spent on guaranteeing a dignified life for all human beings. As we approach the 77th anniversary of the criminal atomic bombing which spread destruction and death over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, nothing can justify humanity continuing to be threatened by the existence of over 13,000 nuclear weapons, 3,825 of which are deployed, ready for immediate use, plunging us into a nuclear winter. The complete elimination of nuclear weapons in a transparent, verifiable and irreversible way is and must continue to be a top priority when it comes to disarmament. This is the only way we can guarantee that humanity will never again suffer its terrible impact. Chair, Cuba is firmly committed to nuclear disarmament. Our country's leadership in writing and negotiating the TPNW demonstrated this. Under Cuba's initiative, and supported by the non-aligned movement, the UN General Assembly agreed to mark 26th of September as an International Day for the total elimination of nuclear weapons. When Cuba recently presided over the Conference on Disarmament, one of our priorities was the promotion of nuclear disarmament. This position is in line with our foreign policy principles, which are laid out in the Republic's Constitution, which was adopted 2 years ago by universal referendum, in which we establish the fact that Cuba rejects the existence, proliferation or use of nuclear weapons. We are proud to have been the 5th state to ratify this treaty, and that Latin America and the Caribbean has the greatest number of state parties at this current time. Furthermore, Cuba begins to the first region in the world to declare itself to be a zone of peace, in light of which Latin America and the Caribbean has identified the promotion of nuclear disarmament as a priority. Chair, the TPNW is the first international legal standard that categorically prohibits nuclear weapons in any circumstance and provides for their complete elimination. This important instrument, which explicitly states that the use of nuclear weapons is an act that runs counter to international law and international humanitarian law, enriches the international architecture for security, disarmament and non-proliferation. We all have the responsibility to adopt in this first meeting significant decisions aiming to guarantee the effective implementation of this treaty as well as its universalization. The Cuban delegation will do all it can to contribute to this purpose. Chair, achieving nuclear disarmament is a question of survival. The time has come to act. As leader of the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro Ruth said, who was an unwavering fighter for peace and nuclear disarmament, and I quote, "The use of nuclear weapons in another war would mean the end of all humanity. Any government in this world is obliged to respect the right to life for any nation and all people on the planet. When the very livelihood of your species, your people, or the people that you love most runs such a risk, nobody can permit themselves the luxury of being indifferent, nor can we lose a single minute when it comes to demanding that this right is respected. Tomorrow will be too late. In a nuclear war, the collateral damage would be the life of all humanity. End quote. We deserve and we need a world with lasting, fair and sustainable peace for all. A world free of nuclear weapons for the well-being of current and future generations. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Cuba for his statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency the Honourable Phil Twyford, Minister for Disarmament and Arms Control of New Zealand.
E ngā mana, e ngā reo, tēnā koutou katoa. Mr. President, my warm congratulations to you on the assumption of the presidency of this inaugural meeting of the States Party to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. You have New Zealand's full support here in this room and oceans away. It's my honour to represent New Zealand at this meeting as Minister for Disarmament and Arms Control. And it's humbling to spend this week with the brave survivors of nuclear weapons use and testing, and with the states, international organisations and civil society representatives who, like New Zealand, remain determined to ensure nuclear weapons are never used again under any circumstances. This determination has never been more necessary. Despite what we know about the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and the growing risks, 9 states still possess the destructive firepower to end life as we know it. Disarmament efforts have slowed and in some cases reversed, with nuclear arsenals now being modernised and expanded at the cost of billions of dollars. President Putin's nuclear mobilisation orders and his threats to use nuclear weapons in Russia's illegal and unjustified invasion of Ukraine have brought us once more to the brink of a nuclear catastrophe. North Korea's ongoing efforts to develop its nuclear weapons program provide clear evidence of the proliferation consequences of nuclear weapons remaining the coercive weapon of choice. But we cannot and must not be intimidated or discouraged. We must protect and preserve humanity and the rule of law. We must do all we can to prevent the nuclear nightmare from ever becoming a reality. And in New Zealand's view, this treaty is a significant step in that direction. It's been inspiring to see the membership of the treaty grow. And I'm proud that 10 of the first 50 states were from the Pacific, a region, our region, that bears the scars of decades of nuclear testing. Being here surrounded by partners from the Pacific, Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, Central and Southeast Asia and Europe is a clear reminder that our mission is global. Our different geographies, histories, cultures and politics have all led us to the same conclusion, that nuclear weapons are immoral and illegal and their tyranny must end. I too am very encouraged by the attendance of observers at this meeting. Observers who have not signed up to the treaty yet, but who share the goal of a world without nuclear weapons. I say to the observers here, your engagement at a time when communication, trust and confidence building is so essential is welcome and appreciated. Colleagues, the agenda ahead of us is full. We've got important decisions to take to ensure that this treaty continues on the road to success. A sound decision on timelines and deadlines for the fulfilment of the treaty's disarmament obligations will be critical. And I'm pleased that we can draw on the experiences of other key disarmament treaties in doing so. We must establish a serious intercessional process on verification to build knowledge and experience and to take decisions when needed for implementation of Article 4 of the treaty. And we must set the direction for implementation of the positive obligations in Articles 6 and 7 of the treaty, facilitated by the expert leadership of Kazakhstan and Kiribati. More than any other aspect of the treaty, it is work on this issue that best captures the humanitarian drivers at the heart of our mission. At the same time, I look forward to the decisions that will extend the partnership of states, international organisations and civil society that's been so critical to the success of the treaty to date. From the adoption earlier today of the rules of procedure to the creation of an intercessional structure and scientific advisory group, to agreement on a comprehensive action plan, you can count on New Zealand as a steadfast supporter and active participant in our treaty's future. Let us focus now on our immediate tasks and have confidence that the message that we will send from our first meeting is one of commitment to and resolute belief in the necessary and urgent elimination of nuclear weapons. A message that we will also carry to the review conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Mr. President, nuclear weapons are never the answer, but our treaty can be. Thank you.
I would like to thank the Minister for Disarmament and Arms Control of New Zealand for his statement. We will now hear a video message by His Holiness Pope Francis, delivered by His Excellency Archbishop Paul Richard Gallagher, Secretary for the Relations with the States of the Holy See.
Mr. President, it is a great honour for me to read now the message of His Holiness Pope Francis to the meeting of states parties. I am pleased to greet you and the other distinguished participants on the occasion of this first meeting of states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. In my message to the diplomatic conference convened 5 years ago to negotiate this treaty, I asked, why give ourselves this demanding and forward-looking goal of a world without nuclear weapons? In the present international context, characterized by an unstable climate of conflict, which is both cause and indication of the difficulties encountered in advancing and strengthening the process of nuclear disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation. At this particular moment in history, where the world seems to be at a crossroads, The courageous vision of this legal instrument, strongly inspired by ethical and moral arguments, appears ever more timely. Indeed, this meeting takes place at a moment that inevitably calls for a deeper reflection on security and peace. In the current context, speaking of or advocating disarmament may seem paradoxical to many. However, we need to remain aware of the dangers of short-sighted approaches to national and international security and the risks of proliferation. As we know all too well, the price for not doing so is inevitably paid by the number of innocent lives taken and measured in terms of carnage and destruction. As a result, I emphatically renew my appeal to silence all weapons and eliminate the causes of conflicts through tireless recourse to negotiations. Those who wage war forget humanity. Peace is indivisible, and to be truly just and lasting, it has to be universal. It is deceptive and self-defeating reasoning to think that the security and peace of some is disconnected from the collective security and peace of others. This is also one of the lessons that the COVID-19 pandemic has tragically demonstrated. The security of our own future depends on guaranteeing the peaceful security of others. For if peace, security and stability are not established globally, they will not be enjoyed at all. Individually and collectively, we are responsible for the present and future well-being of our brothers and sisters. The Holy See has no doubt that a world free from nuclear weapons is both necessary and possible. In a system of collective security, there is no place for nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. Indeed, if we take into consideration the principal threats to peace and security with their many dimensions in this multipolar world of the 21st century, as for example, terrorism, asymmetrical conflicts, cybersecurity, environmental problems, poverty, not a few doubts arise regarding the inadequacy of nuclear deterrence as an effective response to such challenges. These concerns are even greater when we consider the catastrophic humanitarian and environmental consequences that would follow from any use of nuclear weapons, with devastating, indiscriminate, and uncontainable effects over time and space. Nor can we ignore the precariousness arising from the simple maintenance of these weapons, the risk of accidents, involuntary or otherwise, that could lead to very troubling scenarios. Nuclear weapons are a costly and dangerous liability. They represent a risk multiplier that provides only an illusion of peace of sorts. Here, I wish to reaffirm that the use of nuclear weapons, as well as their mere possession, is immoral. Trying to defend and ensure stability and peace through a false sense of security and a balance of terror sustained by a mentality of fear and mistrust inevitably ends up poisoning relationships between peoples and obstructing any possible form of real dialogue. Possession leads easily to threats of their use, becoming a sort of blackmail that should be repugnant to the consciences of humanity. In this regard, unless this process of disarmament be thoroughgoing and complete and reach men's very souls, it is impossible to stop the arms race or to reduce armaments, or, and this is the main thing, ultimately to abolish them entirely. Everyone must sincerely cooperate in the efforts to banish fear and the anxious expectation of war from men's minds. For these reasons, it is important to recognize a global and pressing need for responsibility on multiple levels. Such responsibility is shared by everyone and lies on two levels. First, on a public level, as states members of the same family of nations. Secondly, on a personal level, as individuals and members of the same human family and as people of goodwill. Whatever our role or status may be, each of us bears various degrees of responsibility. How can we possibly envisage pushing the button to launch a nuclear bomb? How can we, in good conscience, be engaged in modernizing nuclear arsenals? it is fitting that this treaty also recognises that education for peace can play an important role, helping young people become aware of the risks and consequences of nuclear weapons for current and future generations. Existing disarmament treaties are more than just legal obligations. They are also moral commitments based on trust among states and among their representatives, rooted in the trust that citizens place in their governments with ethical consequences for current and future generations of humanity. Adherence to and respect for international disarmament agreements and international law is not a form of weakness. On the contrary, it is a source of strength and responsibility, since it increases trust and stability. Furthermore, as in the case with this treaty, it provides for international cooperation and assistance to victims as well as to the environment. Here my thoughts go to the Hibakusha, the survivors of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and to all victims of nuclear arms testing. In conclusion, as you lay the foundation for the implementation of this treaty, I wish to encourage you, representatives of states, international organizations, and civil society, to continue along your chosen path of promoting a culture of life and peace based upon the dignity of the human person and the awareness that we are all brothers and sisters. For its part, the Catholic Church remains irrevocably committed to promoting peace between peoples and nations and fostering education for peace throughout its institutions. This is a duty to which the Church feels bound before God and every man and woman in the world. May the Lord bless each of you and your efforts in the service of justice and peace.
I would like to thank for this message from His Holiness Pope Francis, delivered by His Excellency Archbishop Gallagher, the Secretary for Relations with States of the Holy See. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Adalisa Albertina Javier Reyes Mango, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Cooperation of Timor-Leste. You have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to express my sincere appreciation to His Excellency Mr. Alexander Schallenberg, Minister of Republic of Russia for European and International Affairs, for convening this important meeting of state parties of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW. It is a great honor for me to represent Timor-Leste, to exchange views, to reaffirm our strong commitment to promote and support international efforts to prevent the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons to happen. Timor-Leste has consistently shown its support to UNGA resolutions, including the signing of the Comprehensive Safeguard Agreement, the Small Quantities Protocol, an additional protocol to the Safeguards Agreement on 28th of September 2009, and vote for disarmament of nuclear weapons and issued joint declarations on humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and call for total elimination of nuclear weapons. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, we all share the vision of a world free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, and we all have to agree that a nuclear war cannot be won and therefore never be fought. Therefore must never be fought. However, the current nuclear threats exposed by the nuclear powers both in the region and beyond has escalated tensions and threatened regional and global peace and stability. This evolving situation shows how fragile we are living in the high-risk security environment of nuclear threat. Timor-Leste is following with deep concern over the denuclearization of Korean Peninsula issue. The ballistic missiles tests in the Korean Peninsula by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, in spite of the extensive deliberations, yet it remains on regional high-level meetings agenda without any certainty for a settlement in compliance with United Nations Security Council resolutions. The escalation of Ukraine-Russia war has also generated more uncertainties and discouraged regional efforts to achieve regional security goals on non-proliferation, counter-proliferation, arms control, and disarmament. The war in Ukraine has escalated to a hostile situation where a party of the war could justify the use of nuclear weapons for self-defense and ignore its destructive effects for humanity. The threat to use nuclear weapons by nuclear power states is setting a precedent for other states of nuclear to justify the use of nuclear weapons for the sake of self-defense or deterrence weapons. Excellency, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, against all odds, Timor-Leste continues to believe in the power of peaceful dialogue and constructive role played by all states to promote a conducive atmosphere for a peaceful denuclearization of the world. Timor-Leste, therefore, welcomes the joint statement of the leaders of the nuclear weapon state to prevent nuclear war and avoiding arms races. The statement is crucial for implementing nuclear non-proliferation treaty obligation and to comply fully with all relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions and take into account the international community's call for diplomacy and in the interest of maintaining peace and security in the world. Our presence here today is to realize our insistence and strong commitment to comply with the provisions of the treaty. For the reason, on the 25th of April 2002, our national parliament had ratified the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW. The ratification of the TPNW is a significant move to realize Timor-Leste's campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. Timor-Leste, therefore, calls upon all states to sign, ratify, or accede to the treaty. Timor-Leste stands ready to participate in diplomatic efforts or mechanisms to share and exchange views to realize its commitments on the issue and to promote regional and global cooperation for risk reduction and nuclear disarmament. Finally, Timor-Leste remains committed to support measures to implement treaty obligations, including our Article 6 obligation, to pursue negotiation in good faith on effective measures relating to cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament, and on a treaty on general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control. Before I conclude, I want to quote His Excellency UN's Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, this morning. Let's eliminate these nuclear weapons before they eliminate us. Thank you for your attention.
I would like to thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Cooperation of Timor-Leste for his statement, and once again, on behalf of all of us, congratulate Timor-Leste and on ratifying the TPNW yesterday. I now give the floor to His Excellency, the Honorable Alvin Bottes, Deputy Minister of the Ministry of International Relations and Cooperation of South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. President, for the opportunity to address this August gathering. It has indeed been a long journey, and we are finally here working on the implementation of this vital treaty. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, South Africa has been at the forefront of nuclear disarmament efforts for decades. The democratic transformation process in my country fundamentally altered the role of apartheid South Africa from being a threat to international peace and security to a democratic state which is a principled and responsible actor in terms of the maintenance of international peace and security. This approach also forms the basis for our engagement in disarmament diplomacy. Since its inauguration in May 1994, the democratic government in South Africa committed itself to a policy of disarmament and non-proliferation which covers all weapons of mass destruction. This policy, Mr. President, forms an integral part of South Africa's commitment to democracy, human rights, sustainable development, social justice, and environmental protection, which is reflected in our humanitarian approach inter alia to disarmament. South Africa's commitment to disarmament is based on our belief that international peace and security cannot be divorced from development. Global security cannot be achieved when enormous financial and other resources are still being averted to the acquisition of more and more destructive capabilities, whilst more and more people around the world continue to suffer from hunger and deprivation. Our ultimate goal is a world free of nuclear weapons, and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is an important addition to the disarmament and non-proliferation architecture that takes us closer to that goal. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, 24 years ago in 1998, President Nelson Mandela, in his address to the United Nations General Assembly, pertinently noted, and I quote, "We must ask the question, which might sound naive to those who have elaborated sophisticated arguments to justify their refusal to eliminate these terrible and terrifying weapons of mass destruction, why do we need them anyway?" Unquote. South Africa's own experience have shown that neither the possession nor the pursuit of nuclear weapons can enhance international peace and security. The continued retention of nuclear weapons on the basis of perceived security interests of some states comes at the expense of the rest of humanity. Whilst most of the nuclear weapon possessing states justify their continued possession of these weapons on the grounds that they purportedly guarantee their security, it must be reiterated, Mr. President, that we as non-nuclear weapon states have the conviction that their mere existence continues a threat to our national security and to humanity as a whole. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as we gather here for the first meeting of states parties, we have the opportunity to send a strong and lasting signal of a progressive march forward in humanity's endeavors to rid the world of nuclear weapons. This evidently should find expression in a political declaration that addresses all nuclear weapon-possessing states and provides a united response against this existential threat to humanity. South Africa has always emphasized the humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons, as well as the humanitarian imperatives that underpin our search for a world without the threat posed by the possession, use and proliferation of nuclear weapons. These considerations, Mr. President, are today a fundamental and global concern that should be at the core of our deliberations, actions and decisions as we work towards the implementation of the TPNW. We must therefore recognize that this treaty is the democratic wish of the overwhelming majority of UN member states and the people of the world. No longer should the world's people be held hostage to the unspeakable terror of these weapons. We appreciate Austria hosting this virtual preparatory process and also this first meeting of states parties here in Vienna, in keeping with the inclusivity of the treaty and its universalization, South Africa looks forward to future meetings of the TPNW being held at the UN in New York, where there is the broadest representation of UN member states, especially developing states, who are instrumental in the adoption of this treaty. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, whilst we recognize the sovereign right of each state to decide whether or not it would ratify treaties that seek to establish higher international norms, we regret as South Africa any attempts to undermine this new treaty, and in particular what it endeavors to achieve. I have therefore to emphasize that the TPNW complements other international instruments by contributing to the fulfillment of the nuclear disarmament obligations under the MPT, the CTPT, as well as other various nuclear-free zone treaties, such as the Pelindaba Treaty that has already banned nuclear weapons in Africa. TPNW states parties focus on the implementation of Article 6 of the MPT, gives emphasis to nuclear disarmament. This, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, is complementarian and is essential in the face of previous nuclear disarmament obligations and commitments that remains unfulfilled and which put at risk the grand bargain and the infinite extension of the MPT. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, most of these significant events related to nuclear weapons that have taken place over the last few years, both globally and regionally, highlighted that nuclear deterrence does not preserve peace. South Africa therefore calls on policymakers in states under the extended nuclear security guarantee to shift their policy towards nuclear weapon elimination and free themselves from this notion of nuclear deterrence. All of us here today are driven by a sense of responsibility and urgency, and have all made up our minds. We are therefore convinced, ladies and gentlemen, that the current security environment allows no room for procrastination. Humanity cannot afford to wait for the right time before doing away with nuclear weapons. Let me conclude, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, by saying a nuclear weapon-free world is possible. States gathered here today have the opportunity to act together on the implementation of this treaty, thus providing the necessary urgency and determination to bring the era of nuclear weapons to an end. We are convinced that we have a shared responsibility to protect future generations. It is our belief that we should work together, and let's display our courage in a sustained commitment and concerted effort to rid this planet of these horrific weapons. Thank you very much, Your Excellencies.
I would like to thank the Deputy Minister of International Relations and Cooperation of South Africa for his statement. And I now give the floor to His Excellency, the Honorable Thomas Mbonda, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ghana.
Thank you. Mr. President, Excellencies, Ministers of States, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. President, I would like to begin by congratulating you on your election as President for the first meeting of state parties of the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and to assure you of my delegation's full support and cooperation in the discharge of your duties. Ghana applauds Austria, and in particular, Honorable Alexander Schallenberg, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Federal Republic of Austria, for the invaluable contribution towards the organization of this historic conference. This meeting could not have come at a more important time, given the heightened risk of nuclear war in recent times. The collective action of global leaders to secure our planet from the use of nuclear weapons can therefore not be considered as an opinion. It is for this reason that Ghana is proud to be part of this process that seeks to guarantee global peace and security. Mr. President, nuclear weapons are the most lethal and inhumane weapons ever devised by humankind. They are unlike any other weapons, given the scale of devastation they cause. Nuclear weapons are uniquely persistent, extremely fatal, genetically damaging, with astounding humanitarian consequences. That's global climate destruction, widespread famine, and indeed, the utter decimation of our planet once they are unleashed. Today, the threat posed by nuclear weapons is palpable. Consequently, the possession of these weapons makes its possessor a threat to our collective humanity. Mr. President, apart from testing its pollutions, the world has not been confronted with a nuclear weapon detonation since the 1945 bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Nonetheless, the realities of the community continual misery and utter devastation visited upon families and communities is still fresh on our mind. Nuclear weapons explosion has never happened by accident. Indeed, the proliferation of nuclear weapons will always leave the door open for humanity to cease to exist. We cannot allow ourselves to dwell on the utopian idea that nuclear deterrence will continue to hold. The recent rise in the status of nuclear weapons in the strategic communication, military spending, and political rhetoric by certain nuclear weapon states make this risk reduction effort worthy of attention. It cannot be stated enough, nuclear weapons remain one of the most serious threats to our humanity, with severe long-lasting environmental consequences and affront to our common store of life. Disarmament and non-proliferation remain critical to fostering a secure environment conducive for human development, as enshrined in the letter and spirit of the Charter of the United Nations. Nuclear weapons may appear to be far removed from Africa's immediate security concerns, which are more focused on small arms, intrastate conflict, and human security issues. Nonetheless, nuclear disarmament remains a top priority for state foreign policy initiatives, including Ghana. Ghana has and will continue to support international norms that aim at complete and total disarmament and the prohibition of the use of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction that believe that there is no better time to have a treaty such as this one. Mr. President, nuclear weapons in the hands of any state pose an unacceptable threat to all of humanity, posing the risk of catastrophic widespread decimation to civilian populations, not to mention the radiological climatic impact that will reverberate across the national borders. Mr. President, there is no doubt that the entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons has provided a prudent legal pathway toward the elimination of nuclear weapons. The TPNW is a significant milestone in the long global effort to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons. Given the slow progress and frustrations that had characterized disarmament for so many years, the TPNW represents a watershed movement in the global effort to eliminate nuclear weapons. Ghana, for its part, has made significant contribution to this treaty, signing it in 2017. We are encouraged by the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons' successful adoption on July 7, 2017, and the subsequent opening of the treaty for the signature on September 20, 2017. Ghana actively participated in the negotiation and was one of the first countries to sign the treaty when it was made available for signature. The treaty has become an essential component of the general disarmament discourse, reinforcing the Non-Proliferation Treaty objectives, particularly Article 6, which aim at achieving strict and effective international control of nuclear weapons. Ghana affirms that using multilateralism to address global disarmament issues is critical to achieving a safer and more secure world. This is especially important in the light of contemporary threats to world peace and security, such as abiding menaces of terrorism, global warming, and also existentialism threats posed by nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. The government of Ghana is considering the legal instrument that will seal the ratification of this all-important treaty. It is our hope that our country will soon join the ranks of state parties before the next meeting of state parties. To conclude, I urge member states to remain steadfast in their effort to eliminate nuclear weapons and achieve complete disarmament for current and future generations. I hope that this conference will help establish the TPNW as the new reference points for all states, civil society groups, and academia seeking credible progress towards a world truly free of the threat of nuclear weapons. I thank you for your kind attention.
I would like to thank the Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ghana for his statement. We've now heard the last speaker in the high-level opening session. May I take it that it's the wish of the meeting to conclude its consideration of item 4 of the provisional agenda? I see no objection. It is so decided. We have now a number of important procedural decisions to take, but before I do that, I was asked to remind delegations that there are spare headsets in the back of the room for those who don't have any. I now invite delegations to turn to item 5 of the provisional agenda, entitled Adoption of the Agenda. The agenda of the meeting was provisionally adopted by states parties through a silence procedure that expired without objections on 18 May 2022. The provisional agenda has been issued as document TPNW/MSP/2022-1. This document, as well as all other official documents of this meeting, is available on the website of the meeting. May I take it that it's the wish of the meeting to adopt the provisional agenda as contained in the document TPNW/MSP/2022-1? I see no objection. It is so decided. May I take it that it's the wish of the meeting to conclude its consideration of item 5? I see no objection. It is so decided. The meeting will now consider item 6, entitled Adoption of the Rules of Procedure. The rules of procedure of these meetings were provisionally adopted by states parties through a silence procedure that expired without objection on 18 May 2022, and the provisional rules of procedure have been issued as document TPNW/MSP/2022-L1. May I take it that it's the wish of the meeting to adopt the provisional rules of procedure as contained in document TPNW-MSP/2022-L1? I see no objection. It is so decided. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the facilitator, my colleague George Wilhelm Geilhofer, who was with me up on this podium before, for his sterling work in bringing the negotiations on the rules of procedure to a consensual conclusion. And I would like to ask all delegations for their active engagement and for their flexibility. May I take it it's the wish of the meeting to conclude its consideration of item 6? I see no objection. So decided. The meeting will now consider sub-item B, entitled Election of Other Officers, of agenda item 2, entitled Election of Officer. On 19 May 2022, in accordance with Rule 6, Paragraph 1 of the Rules of Procedure, I solicited nominations for the position of Vice Presidents of the meeting of States Parties. According to the same rule, this meeting should elect 3 Vice Presidents. I've been informed that the Secretariat has received nominations from Kazakhstan, Mexico and Thailand. As the number of candidates does not exceed the number of available positions, may I take it that the meeting decides to dispense with the secret ballot for this election? I see no objection. It is so decided. We will now proceed with the election. May I take it it's the wish of the meeting to elect Kazakhstan, Mexico and Thailand as Vice Presidents of the first meeting of States Parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons? I see no objection. It is so decided. I congratulate the Vice Presidents very much on their election, and I look forward to working closely with them to facilitate the smooth conduct of the business of this meeting. Thank you. May I take it it's the wish of the meeting to conclude its consideration of sub-item B of the item 2? I see no objection. It is so decided. I now invite delegations to turn to item 7 of the provisional agenda, entitled Confirmation of the Secretary General of the meeting. In accordance with Rule 12, Paragraph 1 of the Rules of Procedure, I wrote to the Secretary General of the United Nations to request him to designate an official to act as Secretary General of the meeting of States Parties, and I'm in receipt of a letter from the officer in charge of the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs dated 20 June, in which the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs has informed me on behalf of the Secretary General to designate Mr. Christopher King, Senior Political Affairs Officer of the Weapons of Mass Destruction branch of the Office of Disarmament Affairs, to serve in the capacity of Secretary General of the TPNW First Meeting of States Parties. May I take it it's the wish of the meeting to take note of the designation of Mr. Christopher King as Secretary General of this meeting? I see no objection. It is so decided, and I congratulate Christopher King very much. May I take it it's the wish of the meeting to conclude consideration of item 7? I see no objection. It is so decided. Let us turn to item 8, entitled Organization of Work. Delegations have before them a program of work circulated as document TPNW/MSP/INF3. May I take it it's the wish of the meeting to take note of the program of work as contained in document TPNW/MSP/INF3? I see no objection. It is so decided. Delegations will see that the program of work is quite ambitious and time available is rather short and limited. We have a significant of work to do and to complete in the 2.5 days that's left to us. I would therefore like to appeal to all delegations to keep their interventions as short and as focused as possible. On 6 June, I circulated a list of relevant non-governmental organizations that have expressed interest in participating in the meeting of States Parties that do not have consultative status with the Economic and Social Council. In accordance with the provision of Council Resolution 1996/31 of 25 July 1996, under a no objection procedure pursuant to paragraph 4 of Rule 1 and Rule 45 of the Rules of Procedure. The list is contained in document TPNW MSP/22/CRP3. No objections were received and the list was thus accepted. Paragraph 2 of Rule 45 of the Rules of the Rules of Procedure state that the meeting of States Parties shall take note of the decisions adopted through the procedure referred to in paragraph 1 of this rule at its first meeting held after its adoption. The decisions shall be reflected in the report of the meeting of States Parties at which the decisions are taken note of." End of quote. May I take it that per paragraph 2 of Rule 45 of the Rules of Procedure, it is the wish of the meeting to take note of the intersessional decision to accept the participation of organizations listed in TPNW/MSP/2022/3CRP3? I see no objection. It is so decided. The meeting will recall that States Parties also took a number of intersessional decisions related to the dates and venue of the meeting, most recently through a silence procedure that expired on 18 March 2022. States Parties decided to hold the meeting of States Parties now from 21st to 23 June 2022 at the Austria Center, Vienna. May I take it that it's the wish of the meeting to take note of this intersessional decision? I see no objection. It is so decided. The meeting has thus concluded this stage of its consideration of agenda item 8. I now invite you to turn to sub-item A, entitled Appointment of Members of the Credentials Committee, of agenda item 9, entitled Credentials of Representatives of the Meeting. Rule 4 of the Rules of Procedure of this meeting reads as follows. A Credentials Committee of 5 members shall be appointed at the beginning of the meeting of States Parties on the proposal of the President. It shall examine the credentials of representatives and report to the meeting of States Parties without delay. End of quote. In accordance with Rule 4, I propose that the following States Parties be appointed as members of the Credentials Committee: Côte d'Ivoire, Guyana, Malta, Paraguay, and Samoa. May I take it that it's the wish of the meeting to appoint Côte d'Ivoire, Guyana, Malta, Paraguay, and Samoa as members of the Credentials Committee? I see no objection. It is so decided. I should like to inform the newly appointed members of the Credentials Committee that the committee's first meeting will take place this afternoon at 4 in room -2.62. May I take it that it's the wish of the meeting to conclude its consideration of sub-item A of agenda item 9? I see no objection. It is so decided. That's the friends of the President. Yeah. I also wanted to inform the meeting that I have asked a number of delegates to help me as friends of the President for the conduct of the meeting. The list you see up on the screen, and I've asked those colleagues to help me with the documents that are listed next to them. If delegations have comments or questions and want to discuss the intersessional structure, please talk to Ambassador Lucy Duncan from New Zealand. On the Vienna Action Plan, Mr. Shivanand Sivamahon of Malaysia and Mr. Jamie Walsh from Ireland. On the positive obligation, Mr. Shangeldi Shimbiret of Kazakhstan and Mr. Christian Siobano of Kiribati. And for Article 4 related issues, Mr. Alonso Francisco Martinez Ruiz of Mexico. For the presidency team, I have asked Susanne Hammer to be the contact point on the Vienna Declaration. So if delegations want to discuss this document, please speak to Susanne Hammer. And for questions related to the Scientific Advisory Group, please speak to Christoph Sternert of the Austrian presidency team. Thank you. So we have now raced through the procedural issues that we needed to take. Thank you very much for your cooperation on this. And we will now begin our general exchange of views. I should like to inform delegations of the state of list of speakers for the general debate. As of now, we have 29 states parties, 4 signatory states, 7 other observer states, 3 international organizations, and 5 non-governmental organizations inscribed, which of course is a large number of statements for the time available that we have, and we should really aim to conclude the general debate today. In light of this long list and the little amount of time, I hope and I propose that the time allotted for each intervention be limited to 5 minutes. May I take it that it's the wish of the meeting, in accordance to Rule 20, paragraph 3 of the Rules of Procedure, to limit the time for each intervention to 5 minutes? I see no objection. It is so decided. I should also like to inform delegations that I intend to close the list of speakers for the general exchange of views at the end of this meeting. I would therefore encourage all delegations that wish to take the floor but have not yet registered to inscribe themselves on the list of speakers to contact the Secretariat without delay. With these preliminary organizational matters concluded, we can now proceed with the list of speakers. And I now give the floor to the distinguished delegate of Peru. The delegation of Peru has the floor. Please, sir, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Chair. President, rather. It's an honour for Peru to take part in this first conference of state parties to the TPNW. It's a historic moment. And for Peru, it's a real honour to be at this historic event. The TPNW is a fundamental step towards disarmament, non-proliferation, and the strengthening of the multilateral weapons regime. Peru supports the elimination of nuclear weapons in a concept-based and planned-out way. Given the awful humanitarian consequences of the use of these weapons, we would like to encourage the establishment of nuclear weapons-free zones across the whole world, which would be an important step towards in regions that are currently suffering conflict. We should clearly recognise the great advantages that we have seen through nuclear energy and nuclear technology, and therefore we promote their continued use for peaceful purposes. Therefore, we would like to reiterate our strong support for the significant efforts made by the IAEA, their Director General and Secretariat when it comes to applying safeguards and activities to ensure that nuclear energy is used only for peaceful purposes. Chair, the challenges faced by the non-proliferation regime are a major threat to international peace and security, which is why we are committed to efforts for achieving global nuclear disarmament and also the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, as well as their delivery systems. In this spirit, Peru would like to reiterate their total rejection of testing, use, or any threat to use nuclear weapons as a result of the serious humanitarian consequences that they give rise to and which we've heard about in today's conference. Therefore, we would like to declare our strong commitment to continue promoting complete, verifiable and irreversible nuclear disarmament. The TPNW is an essential pillar in the current multilateral nuclear weapons regime, made up of the NPT, which is the central pillar of this regime, as well as the CTBT, and on a regional level, the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean. These are all instruments that work together creating synergy to promote nuclear disarmament, to control the use and prohibit the proliferation of such weapons. Therefore, we believe that the TPNW is an instrument that adds to the NPT because its structure provides a broader spectrum and establishes a framework for providing assistance to states parties to achieve their commitments, as well as to protect victims of attacks or those who've been affected as a result of nuclear testing, whose results we've seen in the conference yesterday, but also today. And this should all be done with strict respect for international humanitarian law. In this respect, today's meeting is an essential arena for making progress towards the goal of the universalisation of the TPNW and coming up with joint strategies for its complete implementation. We're delighted to be part of this process with the recent deposit of an instrument of ratification for the treaty in December 2021, and we'd also like to welcome the similar process currently being undertaken by Guatemala, which will make Central America the first sub-region to complete ratification. And so in this spirit, Peru would like to encourage other states party to the NPT who do not have nuclear weapons to join the TPNW. This will help with our joint effort. And we would like to congratulate those states who have recently joined. We believe that this activity will strengthen our desire to continue without nuclear weapons, but also strengthen transparency in this field and renew a strong commitment to the goal of achieving a world free of nuclear threats. But most of all, this will help to strengthen our joint effort when it comes to promoting a climate of international peace and security for all of humanity. We cannot give up on this path towards a world free of nuclear weapons, a planet in which peace is the rule rather than the exception. We should continue working for a safer and more stable world, because only this way will we achieve the goal of sustainable development for all nations. I would like to end my statement, Chair, by quoting a phrase that we heard yesterday in this room as a representative for the UN for disarmament. And yesterday we talked about the impact of nuclear testing, saying that the TPNW is not the end goal of our work, but rather an instrument to help on the path towards complete nuclear disarmament. Thank you.
I would like to thank the distinguished representative of Peru and give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mexico. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Mi delegación.
Thank you, Chair. My delegation is delighted to see you presiding over this first meeting of the states parties, and we really value the contribution made by Austria to this. We've had inclusive and very fruitful meetings leading up to this. Without doubt, this is a historic event. The TPNW is a fundamental and necessary work on the long road towards the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. The very existence of these weapons has stopped us from finding spaces where we can prioritise cooperation in a fragmented world, and has not helped with international security because of the threat posed by these weapons, which threaten the very existence of humanity. The long road begins by understanding the terrible consequences of the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And with great humility, the survivors of nuclear weapons have shared their experiences to urge us that nuclear weapons should never be used again. These nuclear testings have left a legacy of victims in their wake, and so we are delighted that today we have other survivors here with us. The first resolution adopted by the General Assembly and in the United Nations called for proposals for the elimination of atomic weapons. Mexico said that this was a ray of hope for the UN. My country wants to maintain this ray of hope. And we would also like to condemn the fact that the recent aggression in Ukraine has had a nuclear element. We've seen how important these international instruments are in moments of tension. The Tlatelolco Treaty was negotiated after the Cold War, declaring a nuclear weapons-free zone in a densely populated area. Chair, TPNW is a key instrument in the disarmament architecture, which adds to the NPT and the CTBT, as well as nuclear weapons-free zones and other multilateral efforts. We recognise that this is not the end of the road, but rather a step on the way to say that a world free of nuclear weapons is possible. However, we cannot simply sit here and congratulate ourselves. We have a lot of work ahead of us. We need to renew our efforts to universalise this treaty. This is a young regime that requires constant effort for political support in its adoption. We must also find channels of communication and dialogue for all of those states who still have reservations about the instrument. The prohibition of categories of weapons of mass destruction should never be seen as something that will destabilise international security. We are pleased to see observers here at this meeting, as it is only through establishing constructive dialogue that we can make progress in our task. The treaty talks about the need for an international framework, and we started this task in preparatory work for this meeting. We must continue this in a constant way. My delegation will help to contribute to this. Chair, our treaty is led by the principles of international humanitarian law and international law, and it aims to promote synergies between other treaties. In particular, looking at making illegal the use and threat of use of nuclear weapons, which has already been talked about by the International Court of Justice. The humanitarian nature of this treaty will go along hand in hand with actions with victims, which will be a key driver of assistance, and through broad cooperation, also looking at the environmental impact of communities affected. All relevant stakeholders need to come with a spirit of understanding. And this is why my country has expressed an interest in presiding over the second meeting of state parties, looking at the political nature of the prohibition of nuclear weapons. So we believe it is highly important that we implement this treaty by looking at the gender perspective as well, looking at all different policies and programmes to make it operational. Finally, I'd like to highlight that TPNW was born out of an alliance between different states, international organisations, civil society and survivors. And this should always be a guiding light for the future work of this treaty. Like with all multilateral tasks, an effective treaty requires participation of all those involved. Chair, I would like to conclude with a quote by Garcia Robles, 50 years ago when accepting the Nobel Peace Prize. He said that while security continues to be an inseparable element of peace, currently the increase in weapons, particularly nuclear weapons, far from contributing to strengthen international security, on the contrary, weaken it. And the collection of weapons, particularly nuclear weapons, these days is a threat to the future of humanity. And so it's clear that we've reached a point where we need to seek security only in disarmament. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank the distinguished representative of Mexico for his statement and for the kind words addressed to the chair. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Thailand, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to congratulate you, Mr. President, upon your appointment. I am confident that your expertise and experience will continue to guide us towards the success of the first MSP. My appreciation also goes to your team and all parties involved for the hard work and contribution rendered throughout the process leading up to this meeting. As chair of the Open-Ended Working Group taking forward multilateral nuclear disarmament negotiations back in 2016 in Geneva, which recommended to the General Assembly the negotiation of a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, I am delighted to be here today in the company of so many old friends and colleagues to further lay a foundation for the work of the treaty. This is an important step towards fulfilling our aspiration. The TPNW's entry into force has sent a powerful message that we no longer wish to see nuclear weapons continue to exist. But such an aspiration will only come true when the TPNW successfully turns the tide of global peace and security, leading to a world where the mere possession of such weapons becomes unthinkable, as is the case with all other weapons of mass destruction. To achieve this goal, we cannot act alone. The TPNW must work in complementarity with other existing disarmament and non-proliferation mechanisms and build upon the progress we have succeeded so far by continuing to promote the humanitarian consequences and the positive obligations of the treaty. The draft outcome document of the first MSP, including the action plan, clearly embraces and reflects this principle. The echoes and our collective voice that we are ready to join hands with other parties beyond the TPNW framework. In driving the TPNW forward, we have to be agile in our working method. To this end, Thailand wishes to offer views on the following approaches. First, we have to be scientific yet pragmatic. Our decisions must be based on scientific data to ensure accountability, especially on issues crucial to the viability of the treaty, such as deadlines and verification. Substantive participation from civil society and academia has been and should always be an integral part of our process. In addition, valuable inputs from the scientific advisory group, when established, will enhance the credibility of the treaty. At the same time, we have to be pragmatic, considering views of states parties as well as actors beyond the TPNW framework, so that we can build effective mechanisms to drive the treaty forward. Second, we have to be inclusive. To promote universalization and increase the efficacy of the TPNW, collaboration with all stakeholders must be strengthened by forging relationships with our existing partners, including the ICRC, ICANN, and other civil society organizations and the academia. Furthermore, we need to seek proactive engagement with parliamentarians, the private sector, and the general public, especially our youth, who will become an important driving force for the universalization of the treaty. These stakeholders can also play a crucial role in the implementation of the treaty's positive obligations, including victim assistance and environmental remediation. Third, we have to take a constructive approach towards engaging and building a cooperation-based relationship with nuclear-armed, nuclear hosting, and nuclear umbrella states by emphasizing the human-centric nature of the treaty. Not only does the TPNW constructively contribute to international security, but its humanitarian obligations that reinforce the nexus between peace, security, and sustainable development is also aligned with Thailand's own vision. After all, it is humanity being able to live and prosper peacefully in a sustainable world free of nuclear weapons that is at the heart of all our efforts. And to achieve this ultimately, requires the cooperation of and partnership with all states. Therefore, we must work together to strengthen the commitment to the TPNW's obligations and effectively cement the treaty's status as a universal legally binding norm against the existence of nuclear weapons. Thailand is proud to be one of the first 3 countries to sign and ratify the treaty. We reiterate our unwavering commitment to the successful implementation of the TPNW. Now more than ever, we must do our best to safeguard global security, and we believe that this treaty will prove to be at the core of such efforts. We therefore look forward to actively taking part in this historic journey. Thank you.
I would like to thank the distinguished representative of Thailand and, of course, acknowledge your outstanding role as chair of the Open Internet Working Group in 2016, which brought us the negotiation mandate for the TPNW. Thank you. I now have the pleasure to give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Philippines.
Mr. President, the Philippines is pleased to see and join other states parties to the TPNW and non-government partners 5 years after concluding negotiations and a year after the treaties enter into force. We welcome and congratulate Cabo Verde, Grenada, and Timor-Leste, the latest ratifying states to the TPNW. We also extend a special welcome to the observer states joining us today. We look forward to working with all of you towards our shared goal of a world without nuclear weapons. As the 53rd ratifying state, our presence here today reaffirms our commitment to the principles and spirit of this landmark document, our adherence to the provision in our Constitution prohibiting the presence of nuclear weapons in Philippine territory, and our obligations as a state party to the Southeast Asian Nuclear Weapons Free Zone. The TPNW strengthens the global regime for the elimination of all weapons of mass destruction, inspired by our collective desire to prevent the devastating humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons. It lays down the legal framework for the total elimination and fills in the gap to outlaw all weapons of mass destruction, which has, until its entry into force, excluded nuclear weapons. The treaty responds to Article 6 of the NPT that calls for effective measures relating to cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament. It also operationalizes Action 1 of the 64-point action plan from the 2010 NPT Review Conference, which calls on NPT states parties to pursue policies that are fully compatible with the treaty and the objective of achieving a world without nuclear weapons. We recognize the complementarity of the TPNW with the NPT, the CTBT, and the treaties establishing nuclear weapons-free zones. We do not consider the TPNW to establish a parallel regime to the IAEA safeguard system or the CTBT verification regime. The TPNW reaffirms the inalienable right of states to pursue the peaceful uses of nuclear energy for national progress, a vital need for developing countries in rebuilding their economies, especially from this pandemic. Mr. President, the humanitarian thrust of the TPNW becomes even more relevant today in the face of an increasing, insecure global security environment. We remain concerned about the continued nuclear modernization, development, and testing programs of the nuclear weapon and nuclear possessor states, the lack of progress in nuclear disarmament, the DPRK's recent surge of ballistic missile tests and preparations for a possible nuclear test, Russia's decision to raise the readiness status of its nuclear arsenal, the IAEA's diminishing ability to verify the exclusively peaceful nature of Iran's nuclear program, and the lack of progress on the JCPOA talks, the UK's decision to increase its nuclear stockpile limit, and the lack of progress in the entry into force of the CTBT. The mission that we embark today is clear. We must accelerate our efforts to rid our world of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons must not be used for resolving international disputes, nor in the security and military doctrine of any nation. This first meeting provides us an opportunity to act with wisdom, decisiveness, and a renewed sense of purpose and urgency to reinvigorate the nuclear disarmament agenda. Towards this end, the Philippines pledges to work with our partners to 1. Continue the call for general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control, pursue the treaty's universalization, support efforts to put in place a credible regime to verify the irreversible elimination of nuclear weapons programs, encourage other non-nuclear weapon states to join, sign, and accede to the treaty as soon as possible, assist states parties in adhering to their obligations set forth in the treaty, support victims and communities affected by nuclear use or testing, continue to raise awareness of the humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons and stress the urgency of acceding to the treaty, and take concrete steps to promote dialogue among states parties, nuclear weapon states, and those under their nuclear security umbrella, as well as nuclear possessor states as a pathway towards their accession to the TPNW. Mr. President, the Philippine delegation assures you of its full support as you shepherd the work of this important meeting, and we will stand shoulder to shoulder with everyone towards a fruitful outcome. Thank you, Mr. President.
I would like to thank the distinguished representative of the Philippines, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Chile, please.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. First of all, I would like to express Chile's welcoming of the fact that we are holding this first meeting of state parties for the TPNW. Without doubt, this is a historic event to achieve our goal of a world free of nuclear weapons. We would like to thank Austria, headquarters of this first meeting, as well as the President and the Secretariat for their work carried out, and wish them every success in this meeting. President, Chile stands behind the principle of indivisibility when it comes to international security, as all states, regardless of their size or how much power they have, are responsible for contributing to building an international order based on cooperation and regulated by international law, including international humanitarian law. Our country has been involved and committed to the cause of nuclear disarmament from the very beginning, actively participating in the negotiation of the Antarctic Treaty in 1959, which established the first nuclear weapons-free zone. After that, along with other countries in our region, we drove through the Tlatelolco Treaty, the creation of the first densely populated area free of nuclear weapons, and we've supported all international efforts to make progress with the complete prohibition and elimination of these weapons. In addition, our country has actively participated in negotiating the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has been consolidated as the key international legal instrument when it comes to the disarmament and non-proliferation regime for nuclear weapons. Chile believes in complete and general disarmament, and in line with this, we've dedicated in our support for disarmament regimes and the non-proliferation regimes relating to weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear proliferation. Therefore, we were enthusiastically welcomed the humanitarian initiative that was announced here in Vienna in May 2012, through which we adopted a new focus based on the humanitarian consequences of any use of these weapons. This was a turning point and generated well-deserved enthusiasm among representatives from civil society, whose committed work has been fundamental in this historic process. Therefore, we would like to highlight the importance of this first conference on the humanitarian impacts, which was held in Oslo in 2012, which is really a starting point for discussions between official delegations about this topic, which we are all concerned about, and the growing adoption of this new approach based on people above any other consideration. Subsequently, we actively participated on the Conference on the Humanitarian Impact in Nayarit in Mexico, which was a historic landmark and a point of no return, which committed us all to starting a diplomatic process to negotiate a new international legal instrument. Finally, the Vienna Conference in 2014, which concluded the basis of a humanitarian commitment through which a large number of states committed to working along with civil society to achieve the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and in this context, we have this treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And this is now a pillar in the international architecture for disarmament, non-proliferation and nuclear security, which will strengthen the cornerstone that we all recognise to be the NPT. It is fully compatible with this, and this is in spite of some unhelpful attempts to say the contrary. President, the TPNW is a first step in the global prohibition of nuclear weapons, and its whose use contravenes the principles of international humanitarian law. This is why the treaty includes obligations that are very innovative, such as assistance with victims, environmental reputation, and also tackles the tragic situation caused by the use and testing of nuclear weapons. We therefore consider that this dimension should be appropriately considered in this meeting, including concrete measures to facilitate its implementation, so that we can all collaborate to rise to this urgent task and to meet our obligations, as this is a central aspect to achieve humanitarian commitments of the treaty. We would also like to take this opportunity to call on the complete entry into force of the CTBT, which is a fundamental pillar, along with the TPNW and the NPT, in the international legal framework for disarmament and non-proliferation. President, Chile is committed to the humanitarian dimension of nuclear disarmament and human security, placing people as the focus of multilateral action in favour of peace and international security. During the conference on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons yesterday, participants heard the moving words spoken by survivors of the use and testing of nuclear weapons, which should drive us to be more dedicated in the universalisation of our treaty in order that there are no more victims of this scourge. We value the important role played by civil society in this task, as they are a key stakeholder when it comes to implementing disarmament and non-proliferation regimes. Chile recognises the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons, and that these cannot be tackled by states alone, as they transcend national borders, with severe consequences for human health and survival, the environment, economic and social development, food security, and the health of current and future generations, with a disproportionate impact on women and children. The TPNW stands out, therefore, as the only agreement on nuclear weapons that contains a gender perspective, recognising the impact and dealing with the importance of female participation in nuclear disarmament. Finally, President, I would like to express our delegation's belief that in order to successfully conclude this historic first meeting of states parties, we need to adopt concrete commitments to work for universalisation and full implementation, keeping alive the spirit of commitment and compromise in Vienna. We are sure that under your leadership and with the committed participation of all delegations and civil society representatives, we will be able to get closer to this key goal to preserve peace, the environment and the well-being of all. Thank you very much, President.
I would like to thank the distinguished representative of Chile and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ireland.
President, Ireland is proud to participate in this first meeting of states parties of the TPNW, and I congratulate you, Mr. President, and your team for your leadership throughout the preparatory period. And of course, I assure you of my delegation's full support in the days ahead. While this first MSP is an important milestone, regrettably this meeting takes place at a dark moment for European and global security. Russia's unjustifiable invasion of Ukraine and its accompanying nuclear threats and rhetoric illustrates starkly the urgency of our work towards a world free of nuclear weapons. Russia's actions threaten to undermine the global nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime, and we strongly urge them to refrain from the continued use of nuclear rhetoric and threats. We also reiterate our strongest support for the independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognised borders. So in light of this heightened nuclear danger, now is a time for clarity and courage. And that means we cannot shy away from calling out those who threaten the use of nuclear weapons. We each have a vital stake in disarmament, and the humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons continue to drive Ireland's engagement, including as a state party to this vital treaty. The urgency of disarmament has been further reinforced by our increased understanding of the humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons, including the important work advanced through yesterday's meeting of the Humanitarian Initiative. It is our fundamental belief that nuclear weapons offer no security, as indeed the United Nations Secretary-General said in his opening remarks. Indeed, it is the case they offer the false promise of security and defence. And we know that no amount of resources could provide an adequate humanitarian response to their use. We know that nuclear rhetoric only serves to heighten risks and drive escalation in conventional conflict. To those who have doubts about the treaty, we urge you to reconsider. And we ask, what alternative vision are you offering to your societies, to the global community, and to our young people in particular? The same commitment to multilateralism that drove Ireland in the 1950s and 60s informed the Irish approach to the historic TPNW negotiations in 2017. A vital element of our engagement was to ensure that the provisions of the treaty were fully consistent and complementary with the NPT, and indeed they are. We are pleased to have co-facilitated the working paper on complementarity with Thailand, and we are committed to continuing to emphasise and raise awareness of this complementarity, including among states outside the treaty. The NPT always envisaged a separate legal instrument to give effect to its disarmament provisions. The treaty therefore plugs a vital legal gap in ensuring that nuclear weapons join chemical and biological weapons as weapons of mass destruction comprehensively prohibited under international law. It clearly signals the international community's rejection of these inhumane weapons. The comprehensive set of prohibitions set out in the TPNW give practical expression to the effective measures for nuclear disarmament envisaged in the NPT. And indeed, by prohibiting nuclear weapons, TPNW state parties have created a legal framework that can help implement Article 6 of the NPT and achieve a nuclear weapon-free world, which is indeed the goal of all parties to the NPT, including nuclear weapons states. As well as its core provisions, the TPNW also stands out for its innovative approach to women, peace and security. It commits to supporting and strengthening the effective participation of women in nuclear disarmament and acknowledges that these weapons have a disproportionate impact on women and girls who are more impacted by ionising radiation. Ireland is pleased to have co-authored a paper with Chile, Mexico and UNIDER on operationalising the gender provisions of the treaty. We ask that at this meeting and in the intercessional period priority is given to this important aspect of the treaty's work. The TPNW is an inclusive treaty, reflecting not just states but civil society, academia, parliamentarians and crucially survivors of nuclear weapons testing and use. And Ireland is pleased to have contributed to the sponsorship programme to support broad participation at this week's meeting. This treaty is the latest chapter in Ireland's long history of nuclear diplomacy. We look forward to working with all states to support the treaty's implementation and universalisation, to reinforce its position within the international disarmament and non-proliferation architecture, to give voice to victims, to promote disarmament education, and to move closer to the goal of a world without nuclear weapons. Thank you, Mr. President.
I would like to thank the distinguished representative of Ireland and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Venezuela.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. It's an honour for me to extend the warm greetings from the Bolivarian government of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, from our President Nicolas Maduro and the Venezuelan people. Allow me to congratulate you for your election as President of this first meeting of states parties to the TPNW, along with your Vice Presidents. Today we are meeting here in Vienna as part of a historic meeting with the will to and the purpose of making progress towards the goal of achieving a world free of nuclear weapons. President, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela would like to reassert the fact that it is a peaceful nation, committed to defending the principles of general, complete and indiscriminate disarmament. Our commitment to the process of non-proliferation of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons should also be made clear. The national constitution in Venezuela, in its preamble and in Articles 13 and 129, expressly establishes among its goals the promotion of nuclear disarmament, as well as the encouragement of cooperation between nations, and designates the Venezuelan geographical space as a zone of peace, at the same time prohibiting the manufacturing and use of nuclear weapons on the national territory. Our country ratified the NPT and is also behind the CTBT and the IAEA statutes. Our commitment to a world free of nuclear weapons is reflected not only in the fact that we're a state party to the first densely populated nuclear weapons free zone in the world, established through the Tlatelolco Treaty, but also through our historic culture of peace and dialogue and our daily commitment to international peace and security, supported by the South American Declaration of a Zone of Peace made by UNISOR in 2012. And the Proclamation of Latin America and the Caribbean as a Zone of Peace in 2014. We stand behind the intention expressed by heads of state and government in the non-aligned movement in the Baku Declaration of October 2019, where we committed to redoubling our efforts to eliminate the threat posed by weapons of mass destruction to all of humanity, in particular nuclear weapons. We will work in a committed way to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons and, at the same time, reiterate the right of sovereign states to develop nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, bearing in mind their independence and economic development. President, nuclear weapons are morally unacceptable and should be completely eliminated. The use or threat of use of nuclear weapons is a violation of the UN Charter and a crime against humanity, as well as a violation of international law and international humanitarian law. It has been more than 70 years now since the horror of the nuclear bombs dropped by the United States on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, detonated over a civilian population where more than 250,000 people lost their lives as a result of the explosions, whose shockwaves vaporized everything in their path: women, children, animals, trees and buildings. We cannot allow a tragedy of this scale to happen again. My country shares the deep concern at the threat posed for humanity of nuclear weapons, as well as the consequences of any detonation of these weapons. We must always remember that the complete elimination of these types of weapons is the only absolute guarantee against the use or threat of use of these. It is essential that we have guarantees that we will be able to live in a world free of the threat of nuclear attack. This is why we would like to insist that nuclear powers make urgent steps towards the elimination of these weapons and take effective measures aimed at achieving general, complete and irreversible disarmament. Chair, we all know the consequences for humanity of the use of nuclear weapons and their close relationship with harmful consequences for health, the environment, infrastructure, food security, climate development, social cohesion and the global economy. This is why the entry into force on the 21st of January 2021 of the TPNW is historically important. This is a legally binding implement for the prohibition of these weapons, and it marks a key step towards the irreversible, verifiable and transparent destruction of nuclear weapons in order to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons and therefore achieving the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. The TPNW, along with the NPT, form the cornerstones of the non-proliferation and disarmament regimes, and providing a legal foundation to make progress towards nuclear disarmament. Our country signed the TPNW on the same day as its signing ceremony, which was the 20th of September 2017. This proves how relevant this treaty is, as well as nuclear disarmament, for our country. President, we regret the very small amount of progress made towards nuclear disarmament by countries that hold nuclear weapons. My country is deeply concerned that in spite of the terrible risks and the well-known horrors for humanity caused by the use of nuclear weapons and testing, and in spite of the legal obligations and political commitments for disarmament, no states that possess nuclear weapons have taken serious measures to reduce their nuclear arsenal. On the contrary, all of those states with nuclear arsenals are spending huge amounts of money on maintaining, modernising, improving or expanding their nuclear arsenals, and are placing greater emphasis and increasing the role of nuclear weapons in security policy. We regret the lack of collective effort among those states that hold nuclear weapons. These countries cannot continue exposing humanity to the horror of nuclear conflagration or the extinction of all of humanity. The use of nuclear weapons is a crime against humanity, and no security policy in no country or military bloc can justify the mass assassination of human beings or the destruction of the planet, which is why we must work on a basis of life and peace rather than a culture of death. President, the goal of eliminating nuclear weapons is a political and moral imperative that all member states of the UN should be committed to, in particular those who hold nuclear weapons. Therefore, we will make a call for those states who have not yet done so to sign this treaty. We hope that the TPNW will become universal, and we hope that those countries that hold nuclear weapons will sign up to it, as they are the ones that continue to threaten life on the planet. Finally, we'd like to express our deep thanks to Austria, to Ambassador Alexander Kmentt, the president of this conference, as well as all of his team for the hard work that has been done to hold this first meeting. And you can count on Venezuela's support. Thank you very much, Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of Venezuela and also for her kind words. I now give the floor to the representative of Etica Funds, please.
Distinguished delegates, this statement is compiled by ICANN with the support of Etica Funds, Responsible Investments, and is signed by 37 investors, including asset owners, asset managers, and investors alliance, representing about 230 billion in asset under management. We know that the only way to prevent the use of nuclear weapons is through their total elimination, combined with a legally binding obligation that they will never be produced again. Development, production, manufacture, and other forms of acquisition of a nuclear weapon or other nuclear explosive are devices prohibited under Article 1 of the TPNW. The treaty also prohibits its member or anyone in their jurisdiction to assist in any way with, inter alia, the development, production, manufacturing, or stockpiling of nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. The prohibition on development, production, manufacturing, and acquisition also covers key components. Our point is financing is assistance. It would be illogical to prohibit the production of nuclear weapons without prohibiting the financing that enables the production to proceed. Financing gives life to the production process. The treaty prohibitions with assistance on banned acts means it is also against the treaty to authorize investments of public or private funds in the development, production, manufacturing, or stockpiling of nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. Similar treaties have been interpreted to include financial assistance as prohibited conduct. In treaties with language similar to the NPNW, assistance has been understood or interpreted as definitely include financial assistance. The Convention on Chemical Weapons uses the same language as the TPNW does in assistance provision. The Convention on Cluster Munition also uses the same language on assistance. Our institution is regularly engaged on a number of sustainability issues. Our role have included such acts as encouraging our business partners to publicly commit to action in support of the Paris Agreement, to respect the human rights in accordance with the UN guideline principles of business and human rights, and to respect the OECD guideline for multinational enterprises, among others. The UN Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights provide a mandate to seek to prevent or mitigate adverse human rights impact that are directly linked to their operations, products or service in their business relationship, even if they have not contributed to those impacts. So we think that similarly, the OECD guideline for multinational enterprise recommend that business carry out risk-based due diligence to avoid and address potential negative impacts associated with their operation, their supply chain, and other business relationships. The human risk associated with nuclear weapons are severe and irremediable, and the companies producing key components for nuclear arsenal are contributing to this human right risk. Additionally, the UN Principle for Responsible Investment encourage institutions to consider environmental, social, and governance issues to investment analysis and decision-making process, and these are increasingly codified. There are almost 400 different policy instruments around the world which encourage or require investors to consider long-term value drivers, including factors related to ESG issues. Finally, the example of financial action task force proliferation and financing control show how important non-proliferation norms can be extended to cover non-state actors. In the context of the TPNW, the expectation should be the same, because the stakes of nuclear investment are just as high as those of nuclear proliferation. States bear the responsibility for the full implementation of the treaty and its article, and for ensuring that all those operating with their jurisdiction adhere to the standards set forth. Financial sector actors, including banks, asset managers, pension funds, and investment advisors, often operate across numerous jurisdictions and benefit from clear guidance from states. Businesses are much more likely to accept directives from the states if they consider that states is leading by example and ensuring that the entities closest to it, if not directly associated with it, respect the obligation under the treaty, including by guiding central banks and sovereign wealth funds to adhere to all treaty aspects. Our institution recognizes the importance of both financial and ESG analysis in our investment decisions making. We weigh a number of regulatory and reputational risks and assess their materiality to our portfolio. The conclusion. We encourage TPNW members to require state-owned enterprise fully integrate the TPNW prohibition on all forms of assistance through their operation as role model, and we encourage state parties to incorporate best practices from FATF proliferation financing control and ensure that obligations under the treaty are extended to both state and non-state, including private sector, actors within their jurisdictions. Thank you very much from ICANN and Etica Funds, responsible investors, and all the other 37 that have seen this statement.
I would like to thank Etica Funds for that statement. Before closing, I invite the meeting to very briefly return to sub-item A of agenda item 9. Based on updated information, I would like to propose that Namibia would replace Côte d'Ivoire as member of the Credentials Committee. May I take it that the meeting wishes to proceed accordingly? It is so decided. So we close the meeting for today. I wanted to thank you all for the cooperation so far. We have a very busy schedule to go through in the afternoon. I look forward to seeing all of you again at 3. I hand over to the Secretary General for a couple of announcements.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just a couple of housekeeping announcements. First, there is, in fact, for those of you who are wondering, there is a cafeteria in the Vienna International Centre. You need to cross back over the tunnel through which you came in order to access that cafeteria. The President has also asked me to remind you about the reception that is taking place after the meeting this afternoon. That will take place in Foyer G on the floor that we are on and starts at 6:15 p.m. Thank you.